The United States Embassy in Nigeria has ordered non-essential staff and their relatives to leave the capital, Abuja. This following its issuing of a warning about possible terror attacks.
Including Abuja, the U.S. government has also advised its citizens not to travel to a number of other states in Nigeria's northeast. Specifics about the threat are unknown, but possible targets include government buildings and other places where people congregate in high numbers. The Nigerian police have ordered all strategic police managers in charge of commands and tactical formations within the country to beef up security in their respective jurisdictions. The Inspector General of Police has ordered the activation of all emergency numbers to ensure prompt response from authorities. A similar warning was issued for Sandton, South Africa on Wednesday. President Ramaphosa says it was unfortunate that the United States issued the warning without engaging with his government first.
Meanwhile, Nigeria's President Muhammadu Buhari has urged people to avoid panic and remain calm in the wake of warnings by several Western countries of possible terror attacks in the capital Abuja and elsewhere in the country. The US, the UK, Canada, Ireland and Australia have advised their citizens against travelling to Nigeria. Well, for some reaction, we're now joined by David Otto, who's an independent counter-terrorism and organised crimes expert. David, always good to talk to you. Thanks so much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for having me once more.
All right, so when you first heard, let's start in South Africa, when you heard this threat warning by the US about possible terror attacks, what was your initial reaction?
Yes, of course. This is somewhat how a normal U.S. embassy and trade behavior. U.S. has, 4 levels of trade levels. One is blue, yellow, orange, and red. So what they've done in the case of South Africa is to send a yellow alert, which is level 2, and they've specifically said that this weekend, which is the weekend of the 28th to Sunday the 30th, there is a specific threat of a possible terror attack, and they've also given a location. That location is around Sandton and the surrounding areas in Johannesburg. So it's a very specific threat alert, which the US has given for South Africa. I think the big question in the minds of many South Africans, as is in the case of Nigeria, is, where did they get this threat from? And perhaps, the question is whether there was some kind of information sharing between the US government and the South African government. Of course, the South African president has come up to say that there is some sort of an undermining of the national security if this information did not pass through the hands of other security forces or services. But what is very clear here, is that this was specifically an alert that was given by the U.S. Embassy in South Africa to its own citizens. But of course, it has the wider implication that the entire country will be looking at it. So it's a question of African states still being undermined, somehow living in wonderland when it comes to proactive approach to reporting national intelligence threats.
What about Nigeria? It seems as if that, given the region and the history, that there could be a serious threat there.
Of course. In the case of Nigeria, it's even more worse than the South African case because, Nigeria is a level 3 threat, which means simply that anyone, who wants to go to Nigeria or any U.S. citizen should reconsider travel. But what makes it worse, I have to say here, is that, other countries, as you mentioned, have picked up on this threat, from the U.S. Embassy, and the UK has issued the same, Canada, as you mentioned, Ireland. And, that threat has been elevated. On the 26th, it was a case of US asking its non-essential staff to leave Abuja and Nigeria in general. But yesterday, it did ask for family members of, its staff, which means the threat has now been elevated to a level where there has been warning that, people should not travel this weekend, that people should avoid places of worship, critical infrastructures. And perhaps, it calls for a general panic within the Nigerian populace. But clearly, the Nigerian security agencies have reacted to that threat. They've deployed counterinsurgency and counter-terrorism training operations. We understand that some raids have been carried out by security agencies, the Department of State Security, working together with some U.S. foreign forces, and a number of so-called Islamic State individuals or suspects have been arrested within Abuja. So there is some level, that the Nigerian government seems to be taking that threat very seriously. But the big question is, why do we need to react on the basis of a threat that comes from the U.S. government? Why did this threat not come from the Nigerian security agencies themselves? And some of the government officials, for example, the Minister of Culture and Information, has come up to say that this is just a usual U.S. behavior and that there is nothing serious. But what we know is that the Nigerian police and the security services are acting or reacting upon this threat that was issued by the U.S. So it's very concerning and undermining, to say the least.
How much confidence do you have in Nigerian security intelligence? I mean, it wasn't that long ago that the headquarters of the police was bombed in Abuja.
You're very correct. I mean, if you look at the history, of Nigeria in terms of the various threats, it tells you that there is a very high level of vulnerability. And I have to say that each country is measured by its threats, so both internal and external threats, its vulnerability, that is how often and how easy it is for a criminal agent, to carry out a strike, and also its capacity and capability, which means simply what resources and what kind of capabilities does it have in terms of its police, its military, and its intelligence units, and that has demonstrated over time that there is a clear weakness, and perhaps this is the reason why the U.S. has decided to go its own way without carrying the Nigerian government behind. Of course, of the Boko Haram attacks that occurred in the 2000s, with the kidnap of the Chibok girls in huge numbers. We talk about bandits, kidnapping children from schools, in massive numbers. We talk about the UN building, as you rightly mentioned, which was bombed in 2011 by elements of Boko Haram. There has been incidents of, military helicopters being shot down by bandits. We talk about prison breaks. We talk about trains being attacked and, people being kidnapped, security officials being kidnapped. So there has been a lot of incidents that, have occurred that it brings into question the proactiveness and the capabilities of the Nigerian security forces to deal with threats. And that is why, everyone is concerned, but, concerned for two reasons. One, that it is an external party that is, giving such a threat to the public. And number two, that the government is denying it, but at the same time, they are deploying their forces, to go and deal with the threat without asking the U.S. government, the basis and the evidence of this threat. I mean, I just listened to the Commissioner of Police, for Abuja, and he made it very clear that they've deployed their forces, but he didn't say anything about verification and working with the U.S. Embassy to determine what the source of this threat is. Very concerning, as we speak.
What about South Africa? Let's come back to this country, and some might ask questions that, this time last year, the South African Security Agency, some said, was found wanting when we had all of that social unrest, that there was chatter before it took place, and it took place and it looked as if they were caught by surprise?
I think clearly what one wants to see with countries like South Africa, but also like Nigeria, that represent Africa in so many respects, is that level of proactiveness. I mean, intelligence, it's a key corner, it's a cornerstone, in every country's national security abilities. And what we want to see in the case of countries like South Africa is to represent Africa in that domain. Now, where there are lapses, in terms of intelligence gathering, in mechanisms in place, but also in terms of proactiveness in getting information to the public, and how do you get that information without making the public panic? And this is where I think there has to be a lot of work being done, between the South African security agencies, and also the Nigerian agencies, to ensure that they are ahead of the game. I mean, it's very embarrassing, for a country like South Africa or Nigeria, for a foreign nation like the US to come into its own country and then talk about the presence of a security threat in a location as critical as Santin, and in an environment as key as Johannesburg, which of course lies the seat of power, very close to Pretoria. So I think it's very important for a very strong review of the national security infrastructure within the South African government. They have to be able to be at the forefront of this, and not allow countries like the US to be the source of intelligence, especially of this nature.
All right. Well, that's where we'll have to leave it for the time being. David, always good talking to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's independent security analyst David Otto speaking to us about terror threats that have been raised by the United States and other countries, in Nigeria in particular, and also by the US here in South Africa. Authorities here, though, say that they are confident that they're on top of the situation and that there's no need for panic, saying that their intelligence has been monitoring the situation.